If I had a dime for every time that a world-famous, prestigious institute of higher learning held a grudge for 5 centuries, well, I would only have a single dime, but it's weird that it even happened once to begin with. That is exactly what happened to Henry Symeonis. Henry's story begins sometime in the early 13th century. Our Henry was a son of another Henry, who in turn was a son of Simeon. Thus, due to naming conventions of the time, we end up with good old Henry Symeonis. Just for convenience, we'll call the father Henry Sr., and our Henry will be Henry Jr., just to help differentiate between the father and son. Not a huge amount is concretely known about his family or upbringing, but historians believe that his grandfather Simeon could have been one of the reeves of Oxford during the reign of King John. Apparently, a reeve is just an administrative position of the king, like a manager of a manor or something like that. Not exactly true nobility, but his family was likely much better off than your everyday run-of-the-mill family at that time. Also, Henry Sr. was apparently one of the richest men in Oxford during the 13th century, so it can be assumed that both Henry Sr. and Henry Jr. both had elevated societal statuses. This 500-year grudge that I mentioned before, it took shape as an oath that certain students would have to swear by. Specifically, any student in Oxford University that was a Bachelor of Arts and wanted to become a Master of the Arts had to swear by this oath in order to advance their studying. This oath, translated into modern-day English, is as follows. Master, you shall swear that you will never consent to the reconciliation of Henry Simeon, nor will you assume again the status of bachelor. As you can tell, the oath is pretty short and doesn't explain anything. I was going to say it's kind of crazy that this was held on to for basically 500 years, but thinking about it from a student's perspective, I guess it isn't too crazy that it wasn't questioned. You just got into a terribly difficult university, are steps away from becoming a Master of the Arts, and an oath to hate someone you've never met, and never will meet, stands between you and your goal. If it was me, I wouldn't say a peep, at least not around the professors. So, why was there even a grudge? Was it appropriate that it lasted 500 years? Funnily enough, nobody is 100% sure of the exact reason there was one. Big, fancy Oxford University held a grudge longer than some countries have even existed, and didn't even bother to record the exact reason why. Now, there are some theories as to what caused it, but they'll likely just stay theories unless we dig up more old documents and manuscripts. One theory of note comes from a book written in 1608, about 300 years into the grudge. This book, whose name I will not even try to pronounce, but will put on the screen right here, was written by an archivist named Brian Twine. Mr. Brian states in his book that Henry was a regent in the arts who falsely claimed to be a Bachelor of the Arts in order to enroll in a foreign monastery. During my research into this part, however, I found that Brian made this claim with no source cited, and apparently wrote it in parentheses while discussing something completely unrelated. So, all in all, Brian wrote about proceedings 300 years prior with no sources listed in his book. A much more accepted theory is that Henry was a murderer. In the year 1242, he was among a group of men that were found guilty of murdering a scholar studying at Oxford University. King Henry III fined our Henry and his gaggle of misfits 80 pounds. They were forced to leave Oxford under command of the king. At the time, the king was abroad, but by the time the king returned, so had our little Henry. Fun note, according to the historyofengland.co.uk, the average unskilled laborer or servant made between 1 and 4 pounds per year, at least in the year 1300. Skilled laborers, like masons, weavers, and carpenters, made slightly more, at roughly 5 to 8 pounds per year. So, half a century before that, 80 pounds was likely a very large fine. I'm not skilled enough in math or knowledgeable enough in medieval purchasing power conversions, to give you a solid estimate in modern prices, but going based off information on the website, it had to have been over a decade or more of yearly wages for regular workers. Kinda crazy. Anyways, after Henry's exile and return to Oxford, details are still not completely clear, but a number of things happened. Roughly 20 years after the murder, the king made Oxford the center of his military operations and sent the university away from the city in order to help protect the scholars and professors. The same year that the king moved the university's operations, he also issued a letter forgiving Henry for the murder he was charged with. The following years, quite a few scholars left the university. Some have said this is because Henry was forgiven by the king and returned to Oxford. But a more likely explanation is that these scholars simply left due to the king moving operations and due to the ongoing war, which was the Second Barons' War for those interested. Eventually, in the mid-1600s, centuries after this oath was originally created, there was a petition to remove this oath. That petition failed, and we don't have record as to why. And honestly, we don't have much more on this oath itself until the year 1827, when it was finally abolished. No background information was given, or at least none was recorded as given, at the time that it was finally abolished. This was probably due to them not having any information available, which is a good enough reason to abolish the oath, if you ask me. This oath has preserved Henry Symeonis in legend for over 5 centuries, which was probably the exact opposite outcome that they were hoping to achieve when creating this. A little change of topic here at the end, but big thank you to GamerPeeps3162 for being my first comment ever. GamerPeeps, keep on gaming, as they say. Okay, see you next time.